I'm Edwin Hartman, retired some time ago from a Stern School at NYU, but before that taught for more than 2 decades at Rutgers.
And before that,
Well, I was a consultant in strategy with Hay Associates, and before that taught at the University of Pennsylvania.
and you also have an MBA, don't you, from Wharton?
I do. I have an undergraduate degree from Haverford, uh, another undergraduate degree from Oxford, a Ph.D. from Princeton, and somewhat later an MBA from the Wharton School.
Good. So how did you get involved in business ethics?
Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. I had a religious background, and I'll bet I'm not in the minority here among business ethicists. My father was a preacher. I was going to be a preacher too, but I got diverted into philosophy. Studied philosophy, though I also took Greek in case I did decide to go into the ministry. But then, having taken Greek, I decided to do ancient philosophy and did that for a while. But at Penn, early on, I was told, don't worry about tenure, you just won't get it no matter what. So I got involved in administration. And from administration, I thought maybe I could apply the lessons to business. This was a fallacy. Nevertheless, I went to the Wharton School and got an MBA, and then got involved in management consulting until the travel got to be too much. So I started teaching management at Rutgers, a business program at Rutgers, and business ethics seemed a natural thing to do, given my background and my interests.
And your research, original research was in Aristotle, right? Am I correct?
It was. My first book was about Aristotle's psychology, but also about Aristotle's metaphysics.
And so did that, how does that play a role in your thinking in business ethics?
None at first, but then at one of the Olson conferences at UVA, what do you call it? Anyway, Bob Solomon gave a talk and then came out with a book about how Aristotle applied to business ethics. And I had never thought of that before, but it seemed not immediately convincing, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. So I tried it and gradually introduced more and more Aristotle into what I taught and wrote.
And so what about, don't you have a book on Aristotelian, no, that's not what you call a book on Aristotelian business ethics? No.
Yeah, my first book in business was on organization theory, and then I did a book in which Aristotle played a role, but yeah, then finally a few years ago, I wrote a book on an Aristotelian approach to business ethics.
Yes. And is that, how do you think that, has that influenced the field?
Well, I was one of many who brought virtue ethics to bear in business ethics. At least half a dozen of us now, maybe more. I think that, though, that I am somewhat more Aristotelian than the others. I mean, I really knew quite a bit about Aristotle and found some details in Aristotle, found some arguments in Aristotle that I thought were really convincing about moral philosophy and practical, applicable to various areas of life.
Good. So, for example, can you give an example?
Yeah, well, Aristotle is very much a communitarian, right? For Aristotle, the best life is the life of a free citizen in a free polis, free city-state. So the question became, to what extent might an organization be like that, right? Might an organization be like a free city-state? So I have followed that, as have others. One of the most striking insights I got when I read Aristotle was in talking about character, he said, not character is a matter of what you do, but character is a matter of what you enjoy doing. Now think about that for a second. It raises the question about whether being ethical is good for you in a way that I hadn't seen raised before. And then, of course, Aristotle is very much a psychologist, and he would say he has good empirical grounds for saying that the best life is the life of someone who has good character and all the sort of main virtues. Third thing, when Aristotle sort of notoriously talks about how ethics is a matter of getting the mean between two extremes. Now there's a yawn if you've ever heard one, but if you actually read the passage, he talks about how ethics is a matter of looking carefully at all the salient details of any situation and seeing that those different details, such as who else is involved, such as time, place, et cetera, may affect your decision if you do it right. It may make your decision right or wrong. So, a couple of examples.
Sometimes Aristotle's been criticized because he lived in the time when women and slaves were not citizens. Am I correct?
Rightly, yes, and rightly so. Some people have said that for that reason, and because Aristotle is not what you and I would consider a liberal Democrat, small l, small d, and he doesn't like business very much.
That's right.
For all those reasons, how could you bring Aristotle to bear? Well, you just can, that's all. If there's some things in Aristotle you do not bring to bear.
So it's the virtue theory, you think, that is the most important in Aristotle for business ethics?
Yeah, I think so. Understanding that ethics is principally about virtues and secondarily about rules, though the rules matter. But I think students get that, being a person of integrity is more important than sort of looking up the rules and following number 3 and number 7.
But how does that play out in organizations?
Well, just from my own experience in organizations, I really did encounter some people who were people of very good character, whom I could count on, who would tell me the truth, who would listen when I told them what I thought was the truth, who had a strong sense of how their occupation and their character meshed. And then there were the others. I think anybody who's been in business for very long will have an experience like that.
But what I was thinking of, what about the organization itself? Can we talk about the virtuous organization, or does that, I'm not saying that's, Aristotle probably wouldn't, well, would he have said that? I don't know.
I don't know whether he would. I don't know that he would have said it about organizations, but he would have said it about city-states, about the polis. And,
Okay, well then that's...
Right, and I think we can say that about organizations. I think we could, Rutgers, the main campus of Rutgers is in New Brunswick, which is the home of Johnson & Johnson. And for many years, Johnson & Johnson had this reputation, well earned, I would say, as a virtuous organization. There have been some bumps in the road since then, but it was a good example to bring up in class. And well, it's still a good example to bring up in class, but for somewhat different reasons. So the answer to your question, I think, is yes.
So he thought the polis could be virtuous, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then that would apply going backwards to the organization.
Well, I think so. What he might say is, and here he inspires McIntyre, he might say, and does sometimes suggest, that the organization is so profit-oriented, that it crowds out issues of character and virtue. I do not think that is always true. I do think it is sometimes true, but not necessarily.
So, how do you see, I mean, you've been working at this for some time, obviously.
Yeah.
And been at the society meetings. How do you see it, where do you see us going in business ethics? Where do you see, what's going to happen? What will we look like in 20 years?
Okay. I think that we already see that business ethics is more sophisticated philosophically than it used to be. We've got good philosophers on board. That's one thing. Another thing is, and this I think is a good thing, it will be more comfortably interdisciplinary. Yesterday I went to a session, no, this was a different session. I went to a session that featured the book of a young man who was sort of following up on Coase et al., a new theory of the firm he was offering. And there's a lot more to be said than he said, and some of his commentators said it, but it was a great start. And thinking about the theory of the firm from a more clearly ethical point of view is a good way to go. And then we brought in people like Wayne Norman, who have brought insights from political science to bear. I think that's a good thing too. I think that sociology, psychology have a part to play. Now, until fairly recently, I guess this is still true to some extent, the philosophers liked to be purists. They really liked to deal with philosophical questions, not philosophy of, certainly not philosophy in business, that kind of thing. But I believe that began to change somewhat with Rawls. So I think philosophers are more hospitable now than they used to be, and they ought to be. Look, Aristotle didn't see any clear line between psychology and ethics, right? And I don't think there is a clear line between psychology and ethics and sociology. And I think we sort of recognize that in business ethics, and that will help us progress.
I hope so. So you see the future, we were talking about the future of the field and the thinking in business ethics.
Right. It becomes more sophisticated philosophically, and it becomes more interdisciplinary. And what that means is getting people in management and so on to be hospitable to ethical questions. But I think that's happening.
Good. That's great.
There was a time when most people in management would just tell you business ethics is a branch of management. And you don't really need to know anything about moral philosophy to do business ethics. I think there are fewer people now who would say that, or at least fewer people who would say it out loud.
Or who've tried to teach it and have failed.
Yeah, some of them don't, don't think they've actually failed, but I would say they have.
And so what do you think the questions that business ethics hasn't tackled yet? The important contemporary questions that we haven't done a very good job, or we haven't done at all, thought about at all. The kind of the future, what I'm pushing for the future.
Well, I don't know whether I can come up with anything that business ethics hasn't dealt with at all, but I think one thing that we should do more of is think about the organization and society. That came up yesterday when we talked about, when Abraham Singer talked about Coase et al. Eric Orts and others chimed in and talked about the place of the corporation in society. And it wasn't too long ago, when it was all freedmen, right? And I think we moved in the direction of corporations in society when Ed Freeman popularized the notion of stakeholders. But we need more of what the function of corporations is. Somebody was quoted yesterday as saying, hey, we've been good customers, we've accommodated you, we've done all this stuff for you. What do you do for us? And it's addressed to the corporation. A good question.
Good question. Very good. We don't ask that very often.
Sorry?
We don't ask that very often.
Well, we're going to ask it more, aren't we?
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. So how do you see the society? How have you, has that been enriching for you to come to the society, or how do you envision the society as part of your I would say professional life? And
well, it's been absolutely crucial. Not only the society, but other sort of conferences and meetings and so on have given me an idea not only of what people think is important, but also of, come to think of it, what I now think is important. It's exciting to talk to people whose views overlap, particularly whose views partly overlap and partly very much do not. It's hard for me to think that I could do particularly good work in business ethics if I didn't have all of these colleagues. Of course, it's good to come to Boston or Chicago or whatever and have these intense conversations over a couple of days, but then they go away and I go away and we stay in touch. And we read each other's stuff and criticize one another. That's vital. It's vital. And I think it's great that there are people in the Academy of Management who come to our meetings and we go to theirs. That's all part of the growing interdisciplinarity of the field.
so you see that will increase. You think that will increase?
Yes?
Good. And that's a good,
Yes?
positive thing. Some people we've talked to are worried that the social scientists are going to take over business ethics.
I don't quite know how that would happen. I mean, I think we need to accommodate certain issues in social science. People like Donald Davidson, for example, who for my money really was one of the great philosophers of the second half of the 20th century, have, because they studied a lot of social science, and by the way, ancient philosophy too in his case, have really, I think, made the case that social science can tell us about something about what's going on when we talk about intentions, for example. Hilary Putnam, in his extended attack on the too rigid ought-is distinction, has done the same. I don't think we should be afraid of that. I think philosophers will still have much to teach not only social scientists, but others about critical thinking. And I think there's a tendency on the part of some social scientists to think not only that they can take over business ethics, but that they can do so because business ethics is an empirical discipline. I recall some management professor saying with exasperation after listening to some philosophers talk, "Why won't you people operationalize your concepts?" Well, of course, that would be death from the point of view of business ethics. I mean, it would mean that we would have stipulative definitions of what's morally good. Presumably, they would be utilitarian definitions, something like that.
But that's exactly what Bernie Gert did. Remember Bernie Gert and his 10 moral rules? He thought they applied everywhere. No matter what. Take him to the moon, well, same list.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't bother me that there is the same list. What bothers me is that there are dumb things on the list. Well, Bernie Gert's a smart guy. What can I tell you? Don't have to agree with him. And there are people like Bernie Gert and Gil Harman, for example, is one of the few remaining honest-to-God moral relativists around. I mean, people like that perform a function, right? They give us something to think about.
Okay. I hadn't thought of it that way. Good. Any other comments you want to make about your career and your life and your work?
Yeah. There was a time not so long ago when nobody would even think of getting a Ph.D. in business ethics, right? All of us came from management or law or philosophy, something like that. All of these old war horses in the field, like me, the others you're interviewing and so on, came to it unexpectedly. George Brinker just walked away. Marx was his big guy, right? All of us started somewhere else. All of it, none of us would have said, I'm going to do business ethics when I grow up. That includes you too, Pat, right?
Yes, I did business.
And so, I thought that I was pretty good in ancient philosophy. By the time my book came out, from the time my book came out, or even from the time it was accepted for publication, one on Aristotle, I have never taught a course in ancient philosophy, not one since. What a waste, we might say? Well, not necessarily. When I was in the Wharton School, when I was at Hay Associates, I thought, what am I doing? How have I strayed so far? But things came together. They came together for me in a way I think they have come together for other people in business ethics. And one of the important factors about what we do is I think we really make a contribution. I really think our students are better off because they've taken our courses. And I think maybe in some small way some businesses are better off too. And to the extent that we pursue this notion of the role of the corporation in society, we can make a still greater contribution and feel good about that. And that's important to us all, but I think there's a special importance to it for those of us who had this religious background. I mean, where would our field be today without the Catholic Church? Without those Jesuits, without those other Catholic schools pushing this?
Business ethics started, and as did medical ethics in the Jesuit universities.
Yeah.
Yes. Medical ethics started at Georgetown. Business ethics started at Loyola Chicago.
Yeah.
Contemporary business ethics. And it was the Jesuit universities who first required those courses. So there is something to be said for it. And it was Jesuits, not Catholics. I mean, the Catholics, I think they may or not be Catholics, but it was the Jesuit universities.
Do you see a lot of that Ignatian analysis in the field of business ethics? And you talked about the frameworks, the structures.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the question.
Get louder.
Sorry, can you repeat it, because my voice is going. You don't know what I'm trying to say.
This is a bad combination.
Do you see, between the two of you, do you see any St. Ignatius Jesuit influence in the contemporary business ethics field?
As method.
Well, I don't know. I don't know enough about it.
Or just take religion in general.
Yeah. No, I think religion is somehow behind I think the religious impulse drives the moral impulse, and the moral impulse drives business ethics. I mean, exactly how that works out, I don't know. But I was thinking about this yesterday when we were memorializing Ron Duska. I mean, you'd look at his background; he's just Catholic all the way, and he was serious.
He had been a priest for a while, but he didn't like the celibacy. Was not one of the things he celebrated.
No, but then there are others too, like well, Jerry's still a priest, but Manny, for example, and others. It leaves a mark. Leaves a good mark.
And it leaves a mark you would say in business ethics?
Yeah.
So does that make it easier or harder for businesses to absorb this idea that ethics is important in what they do?
You know, I never thought of that. I guess I would say that when business ethicists deal with business people, for example, they don't say things like, oh, and by the way, as St. Ignatius said, I wouldn't say they exactly hide their background, but it's background, okay? So the answer is, it at any rate doesn't make it any more difficult, I don't think, because they don't wave some kind of flag. You know, I can imagine, though, some situations in which, and I've done this myself, I'm not sure I've ever done it with business people, but I found myself occasionally speaking, at least for a few words, in biblical terms, you know, to someone who I think will understand it.
What if the CEO of a place is strongly religious? Does that make it easier, harder to approach that individual, or for them, do you think, to imbue their organization with a strong sense of ethical or moral behavior?
I've never knowingly encountered a CEO like that, so I cannot answer your question. So even though I cannot answer your question, I will give it a shot. Look, what we all know is that there are some religious people who are extraordinarily narrow-minded and literal-minded and Hobby Lobby types. But then there are others for whom religion is the basis for integrity, for caring about their stakeholders and so on, though not necessarily too much. So I think a lot would depend on the nature of the CEO you're talking to. And
the company,
and the company.
like Hobby Lobbies.
Yeah. Well, in some cases, the CEO may not entirely reflect the culture of the company. I think, though, that's the way to bet. You get to be CEO of a company in part because you've been marinated in the culture. Occasionally, though, somebody will be brought in from outside, say, right, we're going to do things different. Yeah, right. Doesn't necessarily work very well.
You've done a lot of work with companies in your consulting career, and I'm sure in your teaching you've worked with students from a wide range of corporate organizations.
Right.
So as you think about corporations, you mentioned Johnson & Johnson as an example. Are there companies that you think have truly embraced this notion of doing business ethically, and places maybe that you can see or identify as having absorbed the teachings of business ethics, and it's made a difference in the way that company runs itself? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, an even more famous example than Johnson & Johnson, in some respects, is another New Jersey pharma company, namely Merck. You know, Merck famously. Well, now this was an interesting one, going back to the CEO versus the organization. Roy Vagelos was the chief executive, and he went to the board and he said, he did not say, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about curing river blindness. He said, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to cure river blindness. But it wouldn't have happened if they'd all said, no, we're not Roy, or even some of them said, we're not Roy. Our own dealings with Merck convinced me that they really are that kind of company. They really do think that way. It's interesting. Right now, if you're, a Democrat running in the primaries, and you use the word pharmaceutical, it's almost a swear word, but many people who have done business ethics in New Jersey, either formally or informally, would say that they found much to admire in pharmaceutical companies. As a matter of fact, we some years ago, with Johnson & Johnson, at Rutgers, we sponsored a big conference on the pharmaceutical industry and the moral issues that it raised. Now, in retrospect, it seems to me we may have pulled our punches a little bit, but still, it was a good conversation. And we had in there philosophers and people from the company and skeptics and so on. It was a good experience, and I think it was an honest experience. Well, politicians too. We had our congressman there, and an honest experience, you know, in which people really could speak the truth to power, and speak power to truth too.
You talk about Merck and you talk about Johnson & Johnson, which are historically good examples that we use over and over again in business ethics teaching. Those examples, though, are from a while back.
Yes.
So what happens to the organization? You mentioned Johnson & Johnson has a few upsets recently. How come that doesn't continue? How come the culture doesn't absorb those lessons and keep them as part of the way that they do business?
Yeah, well, I want to be careful here. I don't know that I know enough details about what has happened in these organizations or at Johnson & Johnson to be able to render a fair judgment. But in both cases, you had a strong, charismatic chief executive. In the case of Johnson & Johnson, he's no longer, in fact, he was no longer chair by the time I started teaching the course. So that could have something to do with it. And then, you know, issues arise that happened before about the pricing of drugs and so on. And the recent political focus on affordable medical care for all has, shall we say, given a certain prominence to drug prices. You know, it's not as though they were super low before and they've suddenly been hiked. It's just people have suddenly started paying attention to them. Well, suddenly, but started paying attention. This is speculative, however.
They've also both changed CEOs a lot. And there's some speculation that Johnson & Johnson has, by changing CEO, the guy puts too much emphasis on profitability rather than on their quality control.
Yeah,
Really serious quality control issues.
I would hesitate to say that, even though I think it's probably true.
No, I read that in print.
Yeah, well, I
I
think
mean,
that's,
I'm not sure it's true, I'm just saying that
Yeah.
that's the word.
Yeah.
Okay, I better qualify, yes.
yeah, I think that's so. Well, this conference I mentioned was partly sponsored by Johnson & Johnson, and their guy who helped us put together the conference was a senior vice president at Johnson & Johnson. And there was a new chief executive then, but from him, this guy we worked with, I got the idea that they still took pride in being members of an organization that had true integrity. Of course, you can be proud of your integrity even if you don't have all that much, because you used to, something like that.
Tom, do you have any questions?
Most of
Running
them,
out of time.
I'm very interested in your passage from organizational theory to business ethics, and you did mention that how it's important, I think, for business ethics to to affect organizational theory, social sciences. You know, a lot of the interdisciplinary talk is about them coming into business ethics and not the other way. Do you see it happening? The influence of business ethics on the other disciplines.
Okay, now what are we asking? Are we asking whether organization theory affects business ethics as well as vice versa?
I think you said, you kind of gave that as a take, and when you said you came from that background and you found the value of business ethics.
Yeah.
Can you see it happening the same way in reverse?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you know, I mentioned some time ago how Aristotle thought that the factual, I may not have used the word factual, but I could have, the factual details of the case really are going to influence what the right decision is. And I think that organization theory done well gives us a sense of what the people in the organization are faced with, how they make their decisions, and whether this is a good way to make the decisions. You can, if you don't know anything about organizations, you're going to say some pretty dumb things about what business people should do. So you better, unless you don't mind saying dumb things, then you better have a sense of how organizations do and should operate.
Well, it's a very broad church, organizational theory. Which areas of it do you find is most appropriate for business ethics to become involved in the dialogue with?
Human resources.
Okay. Tell me why.
But I think also strategy. I mean, organizations still spend some time thinking about their mission, you know, over and above just making money, or what they do really well that needs to be done. So those would be a couple of.
A final question for you. Can you teach habitus? Habitus, you know, the Aristotelian idea of character.
I'm sorry, I'm not.
Can you teach the Aristotelian idea of character?
Habitus. Yeah.
Habitus.
Yeah, you can, because it's something that I think students intuitively understand. An interesting question, though, from this point of view. The students all intuitively understand that there are good guys and there are bad guys. At the same time, some of them have been taught not to think about good guys versus bad guys, to think about focusing on the bottom line. You obey the law and you focus on the bottom line. Okay, so they will say that because they're supposed to say that. That's part of the dogma. But when you get into a conversation with them about, for example, one of my favorites. We had, when I was at Hay Associates, we had a job to do that involved somebody from our Philadelphia office, our home office, going to London and teaching our British consultants something about how to do business research, okay? Two obvious candidates for the job. I was one of them. I had done some research in my time, obviously. The other one was a woman who was head of our research unit. And she almost didn't get to go because, quote, the Brits won't work with a woman, unquote. At the last minute, one of the general partners said, nuts to the Brits, or words to that effect, we're sending Denise. And she shot the lights out. She was supposed to be there for 2 weeks. At the end of the first week, I say, Denise, could you stay another fortnight? She did so well and stayed so long that her marriage broke up. I mean, it's just like a win-win for everybody. But the thing is, there was a time when I would teach this case, more than 90% of this, I would ask the students, whom would you send, Ed or Denise? More than 90% of the students would say, gotta send Ed, hey, this is a business property, et cetera, et cetera. And even when I would do it in public, same thing. Over time, though, Denise began to gain votes. And the last time I taught this course, she had a solid majority. Now, one of the things, here's the kind of factual detail that might have pleased Aristotle. Guys who are sort of ideologically opposed to women being bosses and so on will make an exception for one woman. We had in our unit, a small unit, 3 women, and there was this one guy who was basically a misogynist. But his attitude was, it's amazing. There are so few good women as consultants. Women really can't be consultants except these 3, right? We're so lucky. Now, those people are hard to give me. You got to do it one by one by one by one. But Denise gets over there, and she isn't some girl from Philadelphia. She's Denise. She's different. If they had sent some other woman, disaster. But that is a kind of a common thing. It works across racial lines too. People say some of my best friends are Jews, and they're probably telling the truth, except they think there are only 6 good Jews in the world, and they just happen to be their friends.
This has been a really interesting conversation, Ed. Thank you for being here. Is there something you came here to say
No.
that you want to share with us
No.
before we shut down?
No. Well, I guess I sort of already said it, which is that there were times when I never thought I would say this, but I'm happy now about the way things turned out. I'm really glad to have been in business ethics for all that time. It's been very satisfying, a lot of fun. And one more thing. Pat asked about the conferences, you know. One thing I think about business ethics is that the people who do it are, on the whole, really good, honest people of excellent character. And that counts for a lot, doesn't it?